unquestionable discipline, has always been considered the pati, fundamental and non-negotiable cornerstone of any armed force aiming for success and effectiveness in its operations and missions. In the absence of a solid and well-established disciplinary structure, the military organization inevitably disintegrates into a state of operational chaos and internal disorder, where the authority of the leadership is rapidly eroded and campaign strategies become mere theories, irrelevant in the face of confusion and insubordination. In the official, carefully constructed, and idealized narrative that President Vladimir Putin insists on projecting for the Russian army, discipline is presented not just as a requirement, but as an kotsumom, intrinsic national virtue and a point of honor. He cultivates the image of soldiers who execute the orders of their superiors with an almost fanatical and unconditional obedience, ready to face any risk, including the sacrifice of their own lives on the battlefield, if so determined by the command. However, the harsh and relentless reality, unfolding in the theaters of operations, training bases, and Russian military facilities is diametrically opposed to this ideal. What is observed is an accelerated process of structural, moral, and psychological collapse, manifested by a growing wave of internal violence, logistical disorganization, and acts of retaliation that the Kremlin's high command has proven completely incapable of predicting, controlling, or even publicly admitting. The most forceful and dangerous retaliation against the war is not being delivered solely by the Ukrainian defense lines. It is being perpetrated by the Russian military personnel themselves, exposing a deep and festering wound in the morale, cohesion, and operational capacity of the armed forces. This internal crisis is not just a problem of morale, it is an existential threat to Russia's ability to sustain a prolonged war and to the stability of the regime, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The systemic failure to address these issues suggests a deeper rot at the very heart of the Russian military machine, one that threatens to consume it from within and destabilize the entire military structure. Before we proceed with the detailed and deeply disturbing analysis of this report, which reveals the extent of the ethical, operational, and human deterioration within the Russian army, subscribe to our channel and make sure the notification bell is activated. Your invaluable support through a like is essential for this in-depth investigation into the Russian military crisis to break through the barrier of misinformation and reach the largest possible number of viewers, ensuring that the truth behind the official narrative and propaganda is widely disseminated and debated. A report published on December 4th by the influential Euromaidan press brought to light an alarming statistical and behavioral trend that, according to the publication's analysis, offers a somber and chilling omen of the future instability that awaits the country when the conflict in Ukraine comes to an end. With the intensification of prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine, a small but statistically significant group of released Russian soldiers is making the immediate and surprising decision to sign new service contracts to return to the combat zone. The underlying and macabre motivation for this re-engagement, however, is of an absolutely terrifying nature for the Russian military hierarchy. These soldiers are not returning with the patriotic goal of reinforcing the fight against Ukrainian forces. On the contrary, they are re-enlisting in the calculated and desperate hope of being specifically assigned to the same units, where they served before being captured. The purpose is the kapun, execution of a personal, cold, and brutal revenge. They seek to confront, punish, and retaliate against the very commanders who subjected them to systematic abuse, degrading humiliation, and physical and psychological torture, before sending them, often poorly equipped and inadequately trained, to the front line. Once back, these individuals are being held responsible for a series of mass shootings and violent acts of retaliation that result in the disarticulation, demoralization, and, in some cases, the operational decapitation of their units, eliminating the leadership in the field and sowing chaos. This scenario of fratricidal and internal violence represents an insoluble strategic and moral dilemma for the Kremlin. The Russian leadership is trapped between the pressing need to mobilize the maximum possible effective force to sustain the intensity of the front, and the desire to ensure that these soldiers maintain unwavering loyalty to Putin's cause, instead of dedicating themselves to their own bloody missions of personal score settling. The inability to resolve this contradiction is undermining the foundation of its military strength and exposing the fragility of its control, turning the army into a powder keg ready to ignite at any moment. It is crucial to emphasize that this situation is not based on mere conjecture or unfounded rumors. There is a concrete, shocking, and widely documented case that serves as a grim example and a warning of the depth of the crisis. On November 30th, United 24 media reported the incident involving a Russian soldier who, shortly after signing a new contract, opened fire on 7 of his own comrades in arms. The serviceman, identified as Sergei Yakushev, is currently the target of an intense and frustrated manhunt by Russian authorities, who are trying to suppress the scandal and control the narrative. Yakushev had been released in one of the recent prisoner exchanges and, surprisingly to external observers, took the first opportunity to re-enlist. The Russian war machine, likely celebrating the addition of a seemingly motivated and experienced combatant, assigned him to the 83rd Motor Rifle Regiment, part of the 69th Division. Apparently, all protocols were followed until the moment of the violence explosion. Assigned to the Kamyanka military base, with the expectation of being sent back to combat, Yakushev, in an act of extreme premeditated violence, used his rifle to carry out a shooting that resulted in the death of 7 comrades. Although there is no confirmation that he managed to eliminate the commander who was his probable and main target, the attack caused irreparable and immediate damage to the unit's operational capacity and morale. Yakushev remains at large, with suspicions that he is hiding in the Belgorod region of Russia, openly defying military authority and exposing the ineffectiveness of internal security. The few Russian media outlets that dared to report the case avoided providing any motivation, limiting themselves to citing that investigations were underway and that authorities were on site. The Russian Ministry of Defense, following a pattern of silence and denial, issued no official statement. The Kremlin's interest is clear and strategic: to prevent at all costs the Russian population from knowing that their own soldiers are being as lethal to the troops as the external enemy on the front, which would undermine confidence in the command and the war itself, potentially leading to widespread dissent. Achi, what is your interpretation and analysis of the escalation of this fratricidal violence and the failure of the Russian chain of command? Leave your reasoned opinion in the comments section below, and actively contribute to the dissemination of this critical analysis by sharing Sektet on your social networks and discussion groups. Your engagement is vital for the transparency and depth of this discussion. The most unsettling and revealing aspect for the Moscow government is that the Yakushev case is not an isolated event, but rather part of a pattern. In the summer of 2024, another Russian soldier was sentenced to 23 years in a maximum security penal colony for a previous attack of a similar nature. Dmitry Lobovikov, as reported by Novaya Gazeta, threw a grenade into a military barracks, resulting in the death of 7 soldiers, a number identical to the most recent attack, establishing a macabre, statistically recurrent, and deeply disturbing parallel. The severity of Lobovikov's sentence suggests the likely fate awaiting Yakushev should he be captured. In addition to the long prison sentence, Lobovikov was stripped of his military rank and fined a symbolic and derisory amount of 70,000 rubles. This amount, which translates to about 10,000 rubles, or approximately $132 per life taken, is a shocking and revolting indicator of the infinitesimal value and dehumanization that Putin's regime seems to attribute to the lives of its own combatants and citizens, revealing a cynical and systemic indifference to human life. While Lobovikov claimed to be heavily intoxicated at the time of the grenade attack, which could offer a superficial and mitigating explanation, the Yakushev case appears to be driven by a calculated, lucid, and cold thirst for revenge. Euromaidan Press maintains that Yakushev actively sought to return to his former unit with the sole purpose of executing his retaliation against his oppressors, turning re-enlistment into a mission of assassination and personal justice. This incident is deeply shocking, as it exposes a systemic and advanced moral deterioration within the Russian armed forces and the growing and dangerous phenomenon of returning prisoners of war whose sole objective is to take revenge on those who subjected them to torment and abuse. The publication reiterates, underscoring the gravity of the situation and the failure of the rehabilitation and control system. The moral rot permeating the Russian army has ramifications that extend far beyond the battlefield, affecting the security and internal stability of the country. Russia faces a growing wave of domestic violence, crime, and social disorder, with soldiers returning from military service, committing violent acts against the civilian population and even against other military personnel on Russian territory. This problem is not unprecedented in Russian history, but the current scale is alarming and unparalleled. Euromaidan Press draws a historical parallel with the post-Soviet war in Afghanistan, when the return of traumatized and unsupported veterans resulted in a significant increase in violence and crime. The Center for European Policy Analysis, in a November 2022 article, detailed the devastating consequences of that conflict. Thousands of ex-combatants were imprisoned. About 60% developed alcohol or drug dependence, and approximately 75% of the marriages of returnees dissolved, demonstrating a deep and lasting social trauma that Russian society is reliving, perhaps on a grander scale. The Satue parallels between the war in Ukraine and the Afghan conflict are increasingly evident, numerous, and worrying. The replacement of the term international campaign with special military operation is merely a semantic and cynical maneuver by the Kremlin to mask the reality of a war of aggression. However, the most serious parallel, from the perspective of Putin's internal stability, is the emergence of a new and intense wave of crime, similar to that which followed Afghanistan, but potentially on a much larger scale, due to the number of mobilized personnel and the brutality of the conflict. Veterans from Ukraine are increasingly involved in acts of violence. An April 2024 report by The Independent revealed that 113 active Russian servicemen were convicted of crimes in the previous year, representing a staggering 900% increase. Over 2022, the BBC, in a later survey, indicated that at least 242 Russian citizens were murdered by returning soldiers, and another 227 were seriously injured, numbers that paint a picture of domestic terror and social unrest, with the violence of the front infiltrating the cities and towns. The emotional instability and uncontrolled violence of Russian soldiers also manifest in the occupied areas. In April 2024, the Moscow Times reported the arrest of 2 soldiers suspected of a series of murders in Kherson, including Ukrainian civilians and Russian military personnel. The pattern of 7 victims was repeated, suggesting a worrying and lethal trend of uncontrolled and senseless violence, which transcends the front line and becomes a public safety issue. In Russia, the crime rate is rising, and disillusioned and traumatized veterans are pointed to as the main factor and vector of this violence. Defense 24 reported in August that, in the first half of 2025, there were 333,251 serious and particularly serious crimes recorded, the highest number in 15 years, representing a 10.4% increase over 2024. This increase is not just statistical, it reflects an erosion of law and order, driven by those who should be defending it, creating a dangerous paradox where the protectors become the perpetrators. The core of the issue lies in Russia's systemic and deliberate failure to provide any psychological, social, or financial support for the reintegration of its soldiers. Whether returning to civilian life or re-engaging in the military, the violence instilled and normalized by the army is being redirected against the Russian people themselves. Trauma, anger, and revenge are the catalysts, and Russia is, inadvertently, creating an entire generation of killers and social misfits that will become uncontrollable after the end of the conflict, posing an existential threat to internal order and social peace. The question that arises is, why does this culture of violence and abuse persist so deeply rooted? The answer is not in simplistic explanations of individual deviance. It lies in the institutionalized brutality and the culture of impunity that Russian commanders impose on their subordinates, a practice that is tolerated and even encouraged by the system as a means of control and fear. The backdrop to this violence is a military culture defined by internal brutality, with Russian soldiers often tormented, humiliated, or even executed by their own commanders for minor insubordination, such as complaining about conditions or simply hesitating. The Euromaidan press reiterates, highlighting the systemic nature of the problem and the failure of the leadership to protect its own men. The October 2025 investigation that revealed 101 cases of Russian officers who killed or assaulted their own comrades is a clear indicator of a pattern of violence emanating from the top of the hierarchy. The Moscow Times clarified that these deaths are, for the most part, summary and arbitrary executions, imposed as punishment for failures or disobedience, and not mere crimes of passion. The fact that decorated officers are involved only reinforces the message that abuse is sanctioned and even rewarded by the system. This brutality has a historical and infamous name, Dedovshchina, translated as the reign of the old-timers or domination of the elders. It is the practice of hazing and abuse of recruits dating back to the Soviet era, and which, despite superficial attempts at modernization, persists endemically and brutally. Dedovshchina is the toxic backbone of Russian military culture, and it is what causes soldiers to psychologically break resulting in acts of violence against their superiors and, subsequently, in crime upon returning home. The Moscow Times in 2020 had already documented the resounding failure of attempts to eradicate Dedovshchina, an emblematic case from 2018 where a recruit committed suicide after being brutally bullied and having an obscene word carved into his forehead by his superiors, illustrates the depth and cruelty of this toxic and dehumanizing culture, which transforms young men into machines of violence and despair. Psychoanalyst Alina Putilovskaya, in an interview with DW, explained that violence is a chain of command that is self-perpetuating. The superiors who commit these cruel acts of violence have their own superiors who mock them, for example, by giving them unrealistic orders and withholding vital supplies from their units. These high-ranking officials project an image of superiority, invincibility, and prosperity to the outside world. This triggers very difficult feelings among field commanders, which they take out on their subordinates, perpetuating the cycle of abuse and trauma. It is a vicious cycle of abuse and trauma, where violence is the only means of communication and control. The Yakushev case is the maximum manifestation of this cycle, a man broken and traumatized by his own system, who sought revenge against his internal tormentors and not against the external enemy, evidencing an inversion of priorities and loyalties that is fatal to military cohesion. The contrast with the treatment given to Russian prisoners of war by Ukraine is stark and revealing. Euromaidan Press highlights that Russian soldiers who surrender, overcoming the fear of being executed for desertion, are often surprised by the human and dignified treatment they receive. In accordance with the Geneva Conventions, they receive medical care, adequate food, and permission to contact their families, something many did not have in their own units, where abuse was the norm. The images from the prisoner exchanges speak for themselves and expose the difference in cultures. The stark contrast between Ukrainians and Russians underscores the moral divide, as Ukrainian prisoners are seen crying with relief, calling relatives, singing the national anthem, and embracing freedom after being exchanged. Russian prisoners, in comparison, appear stiff, anxious, and performatively enthusiastic, as if they were still under surveillance and fearing retaliation upon return, observes the Euromaidan Press. It is a cruel irony and a sign of deep dysfunction that the supposed enemy treats the soldier with more dignity and humanity than their own nation and their own army. The repatriated, aware of the lies, brutality, and hypocrisy of their own system, become an even greater danger as they seek retaliation and justice on their own, undermining the authority of the state. While Russia sinks into betrayals, internal shootings, and a crisis of morale, Putin also faces the disloyalty and conspiracy of his generals. One of them even publicly stated that the invasion of Ukraine was a strategic failure from the very first day, undermining confidence in the high command and the overall strategy. The crisis of confidence extends from the rank-and-file soldier to the high-ranking general, creating a vacuum of leadership and strategic direction. The long-term consequences of this internal strife are yet to be fully understood, but they certainly point to a period of prolonged instability for the Russian military. To closely follow the disintegration of Russian military cohesion and the geopolitical consequences of this internal crisis, subscribe to the channel immediately, leave your like, to support our investigative journalism work, and share this video with as many people as possible across all platforms. Your participation is fundamental to our mission to inform with rigor and depth. Join us for more exclusive analyses. Don't forget to comment below on your biggest concern about the internal instability of the Russian army and what the long-term consequences for global security are. If you liked the analysis, share it now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss our next investigations. Your voice is important to us. Leave your comment. We are committed to bringing you the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Like and share. The future of global stability hinges on understanding these internal dynamics. The full scope of this internal conflict is yet to be revealed, and your engagement helps us uncover it.